In this lecture, we're going to cover lenses and perspective. And I want you to realize or think about the choices that you're going to be making as a photographer to capture what you want to capture in front of the camera. That's going to be sort of the overarching theme of this whole class, is that everything we're going to be talking about, whether it's in the camera or in the computer for post-production, is all about our decisions that we make in order to create the images that we want to create. So let's look at a lens, first of all. Lenses are pretty complicated pieces of machinery with a lot of moving parts in them, a whole bunch of elements. This is a cross-section of a Leica lens, representative of pretty much any lens. All of this stuff is inside of there and going on. And so we're going to talk about how we can deal with all of these elements and these things and start to see what a lens sees and think about how we can utilize that to create our photos. So first off, I just want to kind of talk about, and when we talk about this, we're going to talk about some focal lengths and different things about lenses. That the T7Is that you're using, if you checked out a camera from the school for the class, is a crop sensor. It's not quite a full frame sensor. And when we talk about a full frame sensor, what we're really talking about is a sensor that is the same size as a piece of 35 millimeter film. So all of these sort of normal telephoto wide lens markings are based on that full frame sensor and a normal lens being a 50 millimeter lens. On your crop sensor lens, that normal lens works out to be about a 28 millimeter lens. And that measurement comes from the diagonal measure of the frame that we have. So in the full frame, the red square or rectangle here, it's 40 some odd millimeters from corner to corner, edge to edge on the sensor. And so that means that our normal lens is about a 50 millimeter lens. It's a rough approximation. And on the crop sensor, that diagonal measure is somewhere in the 25 to 26 millimeter range. And so we kind of say that the normal lens on your crop sensor is about a 28 millimeter. If you checked out a camera from the school, it has a zoom lens on it that goes from, I think, 18 to 55. And so you can see that in the middle of that range is about your normal lens of a 28. So we talk about all these focal lengths in millimeters. What does it really mean? How does it really apply? And when we talk about a shorter millimeter of lens or a shorter focal length of lens, we are talking about a wide angle of coverage. So you can see on the left in this diagram that when we get into that like 8 millimeter lens, we have almost 180 degree field of view. We can see all the way to the sides on our camera. And as we zoom in, or as we increase our focal length, you can see when we get to 50 millimeter, it's about a 43 degree field of view, which is roughly the same as what we see with our eyes, right? So that's why we call it a normal or a standard lens, is that it has about the same field of view as what we see with normal everyday vision. And then as we start to go to longer focal lengths, you can see that the field of view becomes much smaller. There's other things that happen as we do this, and I'm going to show you some of those things, but I really just wanted to kind of show you and talk to you about what we're talking about when we talk about focal length and the length of our lenses. We're talking about the field of view and how much we can see in our field of view. So here's a way of looking at the different focal lengths. And what we did is we kept the statue in this photo relatively the same size and changed the focal length of the lens. And the way that we kept it the same size is that we had to move the camera. So the camera had to get further away from the subject as the lens got longer. As the field of view got smaller, we had to move back in order to include the same amount of information in that field of view. And you can see on this comparison the difference that makes with our subject in relationship to the foreground and the background, actually. So when we look at that 50 millimeter lens, right, that's the upper right corner here, that's our quote unquote normal lens. So this is about what our eyes see. And you can see that everything sort of has about the relative compression and field of view and way of looking at things that we would normally see if we walked up to this statue, right? We can see the background, we can tell the depth, everything kind of has its space and its feeling. As we move to the left on that, to the 35, you can see that we've gotten closer to the subject in order to do that. And now we're starting to look down towards the top of the platform that the statue is sitting on, as opposed to in the 50, where we're almost looking right across it. You can see also by going to a wider lens, we have expanded the depth perception, right? So in other words, the items in the background are starting to look like they're further away. They're starting to become smaller in relationship to our subject. It's expanding our depth. And as we go to the 24, you can see we're very close, like the red flowers in the foreground are almost not even in the shot. We are definitely looking down at the top of the platform that the statue is on, and our background has gotten much smaller. It is really pushed further back. So the wider the lens goes, the more it kind of pushes things further away. Things that are in the background start to look smaller and further away as we go to a wider lens. And you can see now that the castle is almost the same size as the statue. But if we go beyond the 50 millimeter lens and we go into our telephoto range and we go to a 70, now you can see we're back a little bit further. We're seeing even more of the red flowers. We are almost looking straight across the top of the platform, and the castle is getting much larger. As we go into telephoto, we start to compress the background more. And when we compress the background, it makes the objects in the background feel much larger. It's almost like they're coming closer to us because it's compressing that space. It's kind of pulling them visually in. And as we go to the 100, now we are pretty much looking straight across the top of the platform. We've now got people in the foreground because we're back so far. The background is getting very compressed and really filling the frame. And as we go to the 200, we're absolutely looking across the top of the platform. The background is super close to the statue now, and we've got even more people kind of in the foreground that are filling the frame up for us. So you can see also that as we get in closer with that 24, the hand on the statue is higher than the head. And as we get down to the 200, the hand on the statue is now down at the shoulder height. Because when we're at the 24, we're closer to our subject. And so in essence, our lens is looking up and down at our subject. And when we're at the 200, our lens is looking straight at the subject. And I'm going to show you this in some portraits in a second, and how that can really make a difference when you're photographing people. So just to kind of expand on this a little bit is that we can change the focal length of the camera or the lens, or we can move the camera and we can keep the focal length the same. So we have two different ways of kind of zooming in on what we're photographing. And those two different ways of zooming in on what we're photographing will change the nature of how we see everything. So along the top up here, the focal length changes, but the camera position stays the same. Unlike the last example that we looked at, this time the camera's not moving. And so we have a wide lens and we can see the checkerboard on the ground. We can see looks like an egg and a little basket with an egg in it, and the bird in the net in the cage. And then as we zoom to say a normal lens in the middle, the egg is now right on the edge of the frame and the cage is starting to go off the top of the frame. And as we zoom into a telephoto lens, you can see now that everything kind of fills the frame. We've lost the egg that's outside of the basket. The cage is now filling that whole upper left corner. And we're starting to really crop off parts of the bird that is on the right. But everything kind of has the same relative positioning. So you can see that white checkerboard above the basket with the eggs in it, we get the same amount of that white checkerboard in each image. We're just seeing less and less of the image. In other words, we're sort of cropping in to our shot as we change the focal length of our lens. And that's because we haven't moved the camera. Now, if we keep the focal length the same, like the ones in the bottom, and we move the camera in closer, so you can see the two images on the left side, top row and bottom row are the same, right? So we start with a short focal length lens, and we sort of leave the camera in the same spot. And then on the bottom row in the middle, what we did is we moved the camera forward in order to try to fill the frame the same as we did in the top. We're kind of trying to keep that bird on the right, that little bird statue, about the same size. And when we do that, you can see now that we're not getting the same reveal over the little basket. We're seeing now 3 rows of the checkered flooring as opposed to that one part of a square, because we're moving in closer. And as we move in closer, the way that everything relates to each other changes, right? We're getting in closer, and now the lens is sort of seeing down to that basket and up to the cage in the background. You can also see that we're not getting any compression with our background like we did on the top. In other words, the cage is starting to feel further away instead of closer or in the same relationship to the bird in the basket. And then you can see as we get even closer, we emphasize that even more. And so we can really kind of exaggerate that even more. So there's a difference between changing the focal length of your lens and moving your camera. And so there's good and bad to both. And it really takes some practice and understanding the different ways that this happens before you can really kind of embrace it and make the best decisions. So when we talk about doing this with a portrait, one of the things we like to do with portraits is use slightly longer lenses, because if we use a wider lens, we can create some distortion on the person. So this is going to be a little video, a little animated GIF that's going to show you sort of the difference in the portrait lenses. And so here you can see as we go wider, it definitely changes the shape of our subject's face and the relationship of our subject to the background, right? A lot of things change in this, and a lot of decisions are made. And you have to kind of realize that when we're at the 200 millimeter mark, which is on one end of this extreme, we're really far away from our subject. And when we are at that 16 millimeter mark, which is the other end of the extreme, we are extremely close to our subject. And so there's different things that can happen when we do this. So here's a comparison of portraits from 20 millimeter to 200 millimeter. And with the 20 millimeter, you can see we're kind of looking down at the subject's legs and sort of up at their hair in a sense. And their nose is closer to the camera, and wide angle lenses make things closer to the camera look bigger and things further from the camera look smaller. And so his nose looks bigger, his forehead looks bigger, and his shoulders and his arms look smaller. We are also extremely close to him, like right in his face, which is going to make him extremely uncomfortable. Now, this guy doesn't look extremely uncomfortable because he signed up for this experiment and knew what he was getting into. But if you're doing a portrait of somebody and you're in that 20, 35 millimeter range, you're in there pretty close to them and you're kind of in their personal space, and that'll definitely change the nature of the photo. When we get to the normal exposure, it looks normal and it kind of feels normal. But as we start to go with longer exposure, you can see that we get a little bit of compression and the shoulders start to feel a little bit more natural. The size of the head in relation to the shoulders feels more natural. The ears kind of feel more natural. Everything kind of compresses in a little bit and feels a little bit better. And you can see that as we go all the way up to 200, we don't gain a whole lot when we go up to 200. Really, the optimal portrait lens is probably in that 100 to maybe 135 millimeters. So that 100, 120 to 150, one of those three or somewhere in that range, it's probably a really good portrait lens. So think about your lenses when you're taking your pictures and what type of look you want to get to your lens and what type of look you want to have to your photo, and sort of make that decision and try some different things out and see what you get.